everyone, it's Peter from Rock Daydream Nation, and I've got a special guest to the channel, Davey Cretin. How's it going, mate?
It's going well, thanks, and thank you for having me, Peter. I appreciate it.
We're going to do something a little bit different today. We are going to focus on a soundtrack from a movie that was released in 1980 called Times Square. So this was a double LP that came out on the Robin Stingwood label. It's like a who's who of new wave acts that were in the charts or about to go into the charts in America in 1979, circa 1980. We're going to talk about the soundtrack, but we're also going to talk about the movie, and we're going to talk about maybe New York in 1979 and 80, because this movie is definitely a time capsule of a place that frankly doesn't exist anymore. Davey, what was your first encounter with this movie in any shape or form, or for that matter, the soundtrack?
Okay, when you first brought up doing this movie, I thought I had seen it back in the day, because when we were in middle school, my friends and I would cut class, go to our friend's house who had HBO at the time, and none of us, the other guys, had HBO, so we'd go to his house, watch all these movies, and I thought I had seen the film Times Square, but I got it confused with another movie I saw at the time called FM, which was a similarly themed film about a radio station and a DJ in the early 80s in New York City. So I was wrong, and I had never seen this film. So this was my first time viewing the film, but most of the soundtrack I was familiar with, and it's a great soundtrack, and as we discussed beforehand, the soundtrack is definitely better than the film. And it's a great soundtrack with 20 songs, and almost all of them I really like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great soundtrack. It's been in my collection for like 10 years. I got this LP at a record fair. I've never seen it. I don't think it's in print anymore. I haven't seen it on CD. So it's one of those albums that sort of disappeared. It's probably been deleted, but I'm sure our viewers will correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, it's interesting that you got it confused with another movie, because that sort of says to me that the movie probably didn't make the impact that a lot of films in those times. Because this movie, Robert Stingwood wanted to do another Saturday Night Fever, because obviously he produced Saturday Night Fever, he produced Grease, and he wanted to do a sort of another teenage smash, but using the sights and the sounds of 1979 to 80, but the movie flopped. It didn't do well.
Yeah, the budget was $5 million. It was a $5 million budget, and the gross in the theaters was $1.4 million. So it was definitely a failure. It's a cult movie.
Yes.
Definitely a cult movie. It's a cult classic.
Absolutely. So I guess what got me into this movie was the soundtrack, because I was intrigued. The soundtrack was just so 24 karat gold. I mean, and it's a mix. It's a mix of new wave. There's a little bit of AOR on it, and there are some soundtrack songs from Robin Johnson and Trini Alvaro that actually are the actresses in this film. The soundtrack got me in, but look, the movie didn't make any impact in Australia. I think it played about a run of about 4 weeks, did the drive-in circuit, and then it was gone. And you'd occasionally see it on late-night TV in Australia, but heavily censored. You know, all the swearing and anything that was sort of controversial would have been modified and taken off. So very hard to get. I've never seen really any DVDs or Blu-rays in the wild, but it has been re-released in America. And you are right. There was a festival a couple of years ago where the director, Alan Moyle, had put together a director's cut of some footage of the cut that he wanted to present to the masses that did sort of flesh out a lot of the storyline, the romance storyline between the two protagonists, which had been effectively excised and turned it into a different movie. So very briefly, just the synopsis of this film. So you've basically got these two teenage girls from different sides of the tracks that meet in a New York psych hospital. One of the girls is a very bookish, introverted person who is the daughter of a counselor. Now, this counselor in New York wants to clean up the city. and rid Times Square of the trash and change what was happening in that particular time. Sort of maybe a precursor to a Rudy character, in 10 or 20 years' time. And then you've got another Nikki Marotta, who's the other character played by Robin Johnson, plays this street kid who has rock and roll ambitions. I sort of always think that she's kind of a bit of a Joan Jett or a Runaways character. We'll talk about that, who's got these ambitions. Anyway, they meet in a psych hospital. One of them is released. One of them comes back to the psych hospital, lets her on the loose, and then they basically have these escapades in New York where the father counselor, is basically concerned, and they're searching for his daughter, and they're just having all these different adventures around New York. Parallel to this, you've got another storyline where you've got Tim Curry, who plays this DJ who does this midnight to dawn shift, and it sort of plays like a Greek chorus. So these girls are on the loose, and they're very anti-authority. It's a lot of girl power. There's a lot of message, a strong empowerment message. Let's talk about the songs in this movie. The opening scene of this movie is same old scene with Roxy Music, where you see, the word Times Square, and the camera pans up, the billboards and just the street vibe of Times Square. What do you think of that song, and how do it sort of is used in this movie? Because quite frankly, after seeing this movie, I can't listen to this song and not think of this movie.
Well, it's a great Roxy Music song, a great band. Luckily, I was able to see them when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Brooklyn, New York. I saw them get inducted into the Hall of Fame. I saw them perform. Obviously, it was a very different band from the band that existed in the 70s and early 80s. But at the time, same old scene, that was the scene in Manhattan. It was dirty, it was grungy, and you knew that if you didn't want trouble, to stay away from Times Square at night, because the wrong, quote unquote, element was out there. So it was, when I was a young boy in the 70s, I never went into the city by myself. I always went with my parents to protect me, to guard me and my younger sister. And the odd thing is that in the late 1940s, when my mother was a young girl, when she was a preteen, she was taking the New York City subway all by herself. And I definitely couldn't do that because it was just known to be a dangerous area. And as a child, you didn't want to be on the subways by yourself. But in the late 40s, probably through the 50s, it was a normal thing to do that because the city wasn't so drug-infested, dirty, with criminals, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but this soundtrack is not contrived, because there are some soundtracks where they just throw on songs and it has no relationship to the narrative of the movie, and it's sort of gratuitous. This, I think, is definitely being planned out. And to me, I think this song is a perfect marriage between sound and vision. And you really sort of get the vibe. And I think it's inspired, because if I was like, planning this film in 79, I probably wouldn't have thought about this song.
It's a deep cut choice is what it is, but it fits the film perfectly. Yeah. But as you said before, Robert Stigwood, when he tried to get involved too much with the movie and the soundtrack, he said, let's make it a double album. Alan Moyle didn't want that. He just wanted a single album with all the new wave / punk songs on it. And Stigwood made them make it a double album. And Moyle didn't like that. And he eventually left the film as the director before they were done filming. And he was so upset by this whole experience with this movie that he didn't direct another movie until 10 years later, 1990, when he did the Christian Slater movie, Pump Up the Volume.
Yes. And a lot of testimonies was that he wasn't totally in control. He had the feeling that he was a little bit of sort of out of sorts completely. Now, when you look at the soundtrack album, Davey, there's a lot of different categories. There's a lot of solo female artists that are very... So that goes in the theme of girl power, the strong female messages. There's a lot of street music that is very in theme with what you would call New York. And then there is the soundtrack songs. And then you have a little bit of the AOR, which is the kind of contractual obligation RSO type of artists that we have to have on,
Yeah.
which don't quite kind of fit. So just going in line with the New York theme, Walk on the Wild Side. So that's kind of a very obvious take that you would include on the soundtrack album, being New York. I mean, but it's a throwback to Lou Reed in 1973, 72. But I guess they thought, well, we've got to throw this in because about Times Square.
It's a perfect fit for the film because it's all about taking a walk on the wild side, which these two runaways actually do. And will they come through the film unscathed, or will they be harmed? So it sort of sets the scene and sets the stage for the film.
Yeah.
What will happen?
Another scene in the film that I find quite inspired, and if I can try to put the vision while we're talking, I'll edit it in, is Life During Wartime by Talking Heads. And there's a scene where you've got the two teenagers actually walking down the street of, Times Square. And the camera's panning down, and you have all these various characters, the hustlers, the street pimps. They're going past all the porno theatres, and you're thinking, by gee, this is not Hollywood, this is real. And they're just filming it in Times Square in 1979 with this song, which is kind of an interesting sort of a soundtrack, an interesting complement to what's on the screen. What did you think of that particular scene and the use of this Talking Heads song?
I thought it was great because it was sort of the way people viewed it and the way you heard about it in the media at the time. New York was a dangerous place, especially at night, and danger, war, so life during wartime. It fit the theme perfectly, I feel.
In that particular scene, because there's a lot of unhinged characters, you would hope they got a permit. They're not doing it on the sly. Could have been a shoot that could have gone dangerously pear-shaped,
Well, they probably used a lot of the budget, the $5 million budget for security, to make sure everything went well at the time.
But I think that's one of the best scenes in the film, where it's kind of natural. It's sort of like filming on the fly, and it adds to a lot of the realism. I think the issue that I have with this film, Davey, is that there's inconsistency of tone. Like 1 minute you think, am I looking at One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest when they're in the psych hospital, breaking out of the system? Then there's another moment where, am I looking at Midnight Cowboy? These two characters that are finding their way through New York? Or am I looking at a teenage movie? I don't know. It just seems like there's all these multi-tones about the film. It's a little bit uneven in that. What do you think?
I think you're right, because during the DVD commentary, from what I read, the director, Alan Moyle, and let me get her name right here, it would be Robin Johnson, who played Nikki Marotta. They did a commentary on the DVD that came out, and they said that the way it was cut and the way they cut out a lot of stuff, it just ruined the integrity of the film. And of course, Moyle still was complaining that Stig would force these extra songs onto the soundtrack and in the film, which ruined the film also, the integrity of the movie.
Yeah.
So tonally, you're right. It's a little off here and there.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
It's about girl power. It's the girls having fun together. But then there's this creepy older guy, and what's he going to do or not do? And then the father who wants to save his daughter. But is he really saving her for a life that she doesn't want? So there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of tonal shifts, as you said. I agree with what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I've covered the New York songs. Is there any songs that you'd like to focus in that sort of stream that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, the first song on the soundtrack, Suzi Quatro's Rock Hard. Always liked her because my friends and I remember seeing a video for that song in the early 1980s, I guess it was. And we were all the guys, we all were in love with her, and we knew her from Happy Days. And here's this hard-rocking song that we knew and loved. We also liked the song Lipstick, which I think was from the album Rock Hard, or the follow-up album. So we had a crush on her from Happy Days, and we loved the videos that we saw. I think it was on HBO when we used to cut school and go to my friend's house. He also had a top-loading VCR, this big machine that was on top of his television set. Yep. And you put the tape in the top and it goes down and you watch the movie. So we used to watch movies and tape movies. It was more taping. He would tape movies from HBO, and we cut school. We saw Apocalypse Now and A Clockwork Orange, all these classic films in the early 80s. And like I said, I thought I had seen this movie, but it was FM instead.
Yeah,
But
spot
the
on.
Suzi Quatro song is great. Her vocal performance is powerful, the way she screams throughout the song, her bass playing, and the drums and the guitars. It's just a really powerful rock song. And I've loved that song for close to 45 years now. Excellent song.
It's a banger and a very worthy start to this whole album. And it's
Yep.
really a head scratch that she wasn't huge in America. She was one of these artists that was bigger outside of her homeland. She was like a rock god in the UK, heaps of hits.
Yep.
But in America, her only top 5, top 10 success was with the Smokey and Stumbling In, which was probably off the back of Levitascadero and her 12 appearances in Happy Days. So if she's walking down the street, people in America will probably think Levitascadero, but not really think about Suzi Quatro, because she's a quadruple threat. She's a writer, singer. She's done theatre. She's done everything. She lives in the UK, and I think she's a TV presenter, so she's multi-talented. But yeah, that is a great banging song, and probably the last chart success that she had. Talk of the Town, Pretenders, that's a great follow-up. So when you're looking at the sequencing of this album, it's very strong. Following up, Suzi Quatro with the Pretenders, which was a band on the rise, wasn't it, Davey?
Yes, this was after their first album, but before their second album. Talk of the Town was on an EP they released in between. And the first album's great. It's a perfect album. I love the debut Pretenders album. Probably my second favorite album by them would be the follow-up, the second album. And Talk of the Town is a great song because in the film, the two main characters become the talks of the town. So it's appropriately themed for the movie in that way.
But isn't it like there were a lot of bands that were on the rise and a lot of bands that were known on the soundtrack, but the soundtrack didn't go any higher than like number 36. It only went top 40. Do you think it's because the movie didn't do so well? Because perhaps you would have thought that the soundtrack would have boosted the movie's profile.
And yes, and the soundtrack came out about a month before the movie. But then when the movie came out, it was a bomb. So it initially charted high because it had that rare XTC song, the rare Rut song. There were only B-sides of singles. So that was propelling, that helped to propel the sales of the album, which then ended up doing better than the film itself.
Yeah. What do you think of the Patti Smith group song on this one?
Now, I'm personally, to be honest, I'm not a huge Patti Smith fan. I always saw Patti Smith more as what she did for Blue Oyster Cult, one of my favorite bands, and I know you love BOC too. She was Alan Lanier, the keyboard player's girlfriend, for a long time. She wrote and co-wrote a bunch of songs with them. One of the highlights being she wrote the lyrics for Career of Evil from Secret Treaties, one of the best Blue Oyster Cult albums. I just never got into her voice and her solo music, but this song is so powerful in the movie. Just the lyrics and her vocal performance. And if you listen to it in earbuds at the end of the song, she's screaming in one speaker. I think it's the left channel that she's screaming as she's singing. The background vocals are like this shrieking. And it's just amazingly powerful. And it's a poignant song. And it's the centerpiece, I think, of the whole soundtrack. Lyrically, it's great. The band's performance, their backing vocals, the male backing vocals on the song, and just Pissing in a River is an amazing song. And it's made me curious to explore the rest of her catalog, hearing that song and just the power behind it. It's very emotional. That's the word. It's emotional. It's an emotional, riveting vocal performance.
Yeah, well, that's the frustrating thing about this film, because it's flawed, but there's some emotional bits in it that draw you in. And it's sort of frustrating that, you can think that this project could have been so much more. But it does make sense that Patti Smith is included. You've got a character in the film played by Trini Alvarado, who's like a very bookish, she's kind of a poet. very thoughtful. She's like the intellectual, the poet side of this movie. And then on the other side, you've got Robin Johnson, who's the rocker, and she's very ferocious and very out there. You can see Patti Smith in both of the personalities of the two protagonists. So it makes perfect sense that they've used Patti Smith because she's like a lyricist extraordinaire. She is a poet. She's a rock poet. And it's inconceivable that you wouldn't have Patti Smith on this album. And it just works so well. Ramones, they get a fair airing on this album. You want to talk about how that's used? A lot of the energy, like the action scenes, they bring the Ramones in.
And they played it twice in the movie. And it first comes in, I looked at my watch, it was about 12 minutes into the film. That's when the song comes in. And it's, of course, it's probably one of the two biggest Ramones songs. I Want to Be Sedated, written by Joey Ramone from their fourth album, Road to Ruin. And it's one of their biggest hits. And it just fit the scene perfectly because it's a powerful, upbeat song. And it's obvious that the girls love the Ramones, like the song, because they used it twice in the film. And it's just energetic, upbeat, high-energy tune. So it fit perfectly, I thought. And who's more New York? It's friggin' New York. Who's more New York than the Ramones over here?
Well, it's either Ramones or Lou Reed. I think it'll be a toss-up. It's probably 50-50.
I'd say Ramones.
But but it goes into the New York theme. But it anytime. Again, this is a perfect marriage of sound and vision when there's high energy and they're doing hijinks, like when they're in the ambulance, so they want to break out of the psych hospital and it's a little bit of the Hollywood crash through the barriers. The Ramones is on. So, I guess it's inconceivable. Do you want to talk about some of the deep cuts, which you alluded to? I love that song, Babylon's Burning by the Ruts. What a song.
It's a really good punk song. And I know of the Ruts, but I'm not really familiar with their music, but that's a great song.
XTC, Take This Town. Talk about XTC at that time.
Well, the early XTC, they were more punk than new wave, which they sort of turned new wave, college, alternative rock, whatever you want to term it. There's been so many names. I mean, some people think even XTC of Prague or power pop. So they've done everything, but the early XTC of the late 70s and the early 1980s was more herky-jerky, punky new wave. And the song is called Take This Town. It was a B-side, and it was a coveted song until the record company eventually released it on that B-sides comp, Rag and Bone Buffet, I think is the title of the album, that it eventually appeared on, which is probably now out of print and a collector's item. But Take This Town, that's what the girls did because they became omnipresent in the media thanks to that sleazy DJ that I love, DJ Johnny LaGuardia, played by the weird and wacky Tim Curry. He helped make them overnight sensations, to quote Frank Zappa, and they took the town. So it fits perfectly in the theme, and it's a very good XTC song.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk a bit about the Tim Curry character. Interesting bit of trivia. The role was initially offered to Mick Jagger, and there was some interest. But for whatever reason, the director dug his heels in and he wanted Tim Curry because I think he thought Tim Curry was a bigger draw card. Because when you look at the movie poster and my recollections of the advertisements for this movie, Tim Curry was right at the top because he was quite well known in Australia because of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was...
And he's the only named person in the movie. Everyone else is basically an unknown. Well, they had done smaller films or television roles.
Yeah.
Like the actor who played the main character's father, the guy who played David Pearl, Pamela Pearl, who's Trini Alvarado is the actress. The actor his name was Peter Cofield, Coffield, Cofield. And he actually passed away in 1983 at the age of 38 from an AIDS-related disease, unfortunately. And he was a character actor, and because he passed away so young, he just never became well known. But he was good in the movie. But Tim Curry, the only named person in the movie. And I did recognize the social worker in the movie. She's played by Anna Marie Horsford. She played Rosie Washington, who was Robin Johnson's social worker, who was trying to help her because she didn't have a family, trying to help her get a leg up and just integrate into society. I knew her from television roles. I've seen her on a lot of American TV shows. So her face was familiar, but Curry was the only one I really knew by name.
How do you think Jagger would have gone? It would have been a different movie. I think he would have a lot of control over the project, and it may have gone in a different, maybe less subversive direction. What do you think?
More mainstream, probably, yes, because he was always thinking of how people viewed him.
Mm.
And he's a decent actor. I've seen him in some roles, and he has a small acting career, but Tim Curry's definitely the better actor.
Yeah. Well, Tim Curry's definitely got a bit of a swami element. And look, I know you think he gives you the creeps, but I think
He
that
does.
in the movie, there is menace all the way through.
Yes, Tim Curry is a creep. And he has that vibe, he has that look, and he always plays unusual characters. He's a great character actor. And he was in Clue, he was in Legend, where he played the devil under that heavy, heavy makeup. And of course, he was in Rocky Horror Picture Show as Dr. Frankenfooter. So he started out his career just on an unusual foot, and he's played these weird characters on TV and movies. And he was even a musician. He made 3 albums. And I remember in the late 70s, early 80s, one of his songs was a big hit, and it was played on rock radio here. And the song was called I Do the Rock. And he does sort of a spoken word singing type thing, similar to Lou Reed, maybe. And it was a big song. It had a big sax solo in the middle, a nice sax solo. And he was name-checking a lot of people that were famous during the time, like Linda Ronstadt and Governor Brown from California. So that was his biggest hit as a singer. So he's a man of many talents. He could sing, he could act, he could dance, if you remember Rocky Horror. So, but he just plays a real creep in here. And just the way, like, I always thought that the girls were going to get together and have some kind of affair, but they never showed that because that was cut from the film. And then just the way Tim Curry's character is the DJ, when he brings the bottle of vodka to where the girls are staying on the Chelsea Piers, and it just gave me this very rapey type vibe. And luckily it didn't go to that, but he was just a sleazy character in this movie. He really rubbed me the wrong way, and he was the antagonist.
Yeah.
They're the protagonist, he's the antagonist. I just didn't like his character. Just a very sleazy guy.
You got to face it. It is a bit of a fantasy because you're talking about Times Square in 1979. You've got these 2 teenagers on the loose. They're living in a warehouse and they're having all these hijinks. In reality, Times Square was a million times worse. And they may have come to a very unpleasant end, or there would have been a lot worse. It's a certain bit of Hollywood fantasy to it. But, the Tim Curry element maybe is a metaphor for a lot of the more lecherous type of elements that were in society in Times Square in New York at that particular time. Like, he's really exploiting these teenagers for his ratings, listeners, publicity. He's not an angel in any shape or form, is he?
No. That's why he's the bad guy of the movie. And maybe in its initial cut, he was even worse. And I'm glad I didn't see him as a worse entity, because in this movie, he's just creepy. He just has the look and the way he acts and talks. Ooh, gives me the heebie-jeebies.
But it's you realise that he's actually the bad guy after the movie. I think when you watch the movie in 1979 or 1980, you'd probably think, oh, he's a character, he's sort of helping him along. But it's when you reflect and look back at it, you go, no, he wasn't. He wasn't the good guy. And especially with 2024 eyes and ears, you think, definitely. Like you were talking about that scene about the vodka bottle and, looking at the, that particular scene, that's definitely highlights that this guy is not exactly straight.
And these girls, the actresses who played the characters, were 13 and 15 when the film was recorded in they started filming in late 1979. So when it came out a year later in 1980, they were 14 and 16, which is still very young. And just this older guy trying to use these younger girls, it just doesn't sit right with me. And probably a lot of people, if they thought about it, would agree with me.
And that's why this movie's been probably buried and not really one of, what was the studio? It was RSO. So, Polygram, I don't know. Whoever the studio, the major distributor, that was probably kind of buried in the coffers for a long time, because there are some elements to this that are exactly not sort of family friendly or exactly commercial.
Yes, so, I agree.
Yeah. What do you think of Robin Johnson's performance? Because I think this movie hangs on whether you like her or not.
She was good in the film. She's a good actress. I don't think she was playing the guitar. I think she was miming the guitar in the movie. I don't think she was playing the guitar. She has a decent singing voice. I mean, she's no Patti Smith, but few are, or Suzi Quatro. But she was good. She drew me in. I thought it was a good performance. She was very emotional.
Yeah, Joan Jett had done a audition for the role and she missed out. How do you think she would have gone?
Wow.
Yeah,
probably
because
good, but she was more of a singer. She was more of a performer than an actress at the time. She did some movies a little later on.
She did a screen test for the movie, and there was some interviews where they said, Robin Johnson, that's you. There's a lot of similarities. And she goes, well, here's a little bit of trivia. I actually did a screen test for the movie and didn't get it.
So they probably made the right decision. Although Joan Jett at the time, she was a cult artist because she'd just been in The Runaway. She hadn't really started her solo career in late 79. The first record, Bad Reputation, came out, 1980?
Yeah.
Yeah, so she was working on her solo career at the time.
Well, I think it probably was a wise decision that they didn't pick her in the long run for Joan, because the Robin Johnson story is actually quite sad. She got tied up in a contract with the Robin Stingwood organization and basically couldn't do any other projects for a couple of years. And, she was going to be touted as the female John Travolta, and it wasn't meant to, it just never happened. And by the time she got out the other side, the acting offers had dried up. And she's done a few little bit parts here and there, but she became a traffic reporter for an LA network. And she gave the acting thing away. But I think her performance in this movie is the emotional raw heart. And you've got to like her to like the movie or be drawn into the movie, because it really all kind of centers around her. She's the energy of the film. Yeah, if you don't believe her, then you kind of don't believe the movie. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, and it's a shame that she got tied up in this contract with Robert Stigwood's RSO Records and Pictures, and they said, oh, we're going to make you a star, you're going to have albums, you're going to have movies, you're going to be a big star. And it's one of those sad Hollywood stories where not everyone could be the big star, and she was promised the moon and she got nothing. And she had to take a job as a bank teller just to earn money so she could survive. And then it's just one of those just sad stories about Hollywood.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, on this soundtrack album, there's a couple of what I call black sheep type songs that just stick out. And I'm talking about the AOR songs. So you've got Help Me by Marcy Levy and Robin Gibb. Do you think this is the contractual obligation? We've got to put a BG on an RSO album?
Definitely. That's Stigwood. He did that. That's all Stigwood. It has to be.
Does it stick out, or you can? Does it stick out, or you can forgive it in the context of the soundtrack and the movie?
It's definitely a tacked-on song, and they used it in the closing credits. But that's when you're supposed to put the big song in the closing credits. But it just doesn't fit the whole theme of the movie, the vibe of the movie.
Do you ever sit through the credits in a movie, Davey, or do you
All the
hightail it
time,
out?
for years. I'm the one out of all my friends. I used to pick most of the movies that we saw in the 1980s. And then when we went to see Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I wanted to stay for the musical credits, which I always do to this day, stay until the end of the credits. And that was the first movie I remember that had something after the credits. In Ferris Bueller's Day Off, all of a sudden you see the shower curtain open, and it's Matthew Broderick playing Ferris, and he has like a shower cap on. He's all wet. And he said, "What are you still doing here? Go home. The movie's over." Something like that. So after that, I said, okay, now I'm definitely staying to watch all the credits. And that was 1985. So I'm a big credits guy just to see the music credits, which are all the way at the end of the film. It's the last thing in the credits that you see, the music credits, who wrote, who played, where the song is from. So I always like to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Desmond Child and Rogue, that would be under the category of AOR. That's a little bit. What do you think of that song?
I think that fits better than the previous song you mentioned. It's got female vocals, so that fits in, because Desmond Child was the songwriter and played the instruments, and Rogue were his female backing band. The three, not the band, they were the singers. He had three singers that all had a distinct, different look. Because I've seen the records working in record stores for years. I've seen all the Desmond Child and Rogue albums. And in fact, I've seen the Times Square soundtrack on vinyl that you showed earlier. It was just never really a big seller because it's such a cult film. That's it. We always had a copy of that in the stores and a few in the overstock also.
Did
It's
that
not a
tick
big
over?
mover.
It didn't. It didn't move. It didn't move. Yeah.
Not in the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah. I agree that Desmond Child and Rogue works better than the Robin Gibb song, because the Robin Gibb song kind of, to me, belongs to another movie. Doesn't belong to this movie. So yeah, it doesn't.
Point.
It doesn't quite fit. Let's talk about the punk subversiveness of the two female characters. So towards the end, and its influence on a lot of the girl punk bands, I find it quite interesting. In pop culture, that bit where they put the spray painted banded mask. I know Michael Stipe's done it, and there's a few other characters. You want to talk about that?
Oh, I definitely do. Because when I worked in the record stores in the mid-90s, I discovered this band through just playing a CD that the name just flew right out of my head. But the band is the Manic Street Preachers. And their bass player, and who became their eventual lyricist, once their rhythm guitar player lyricist mysteriously disappeared. Nicky Wire, the bass player from the Manic Street Preachers, has worn that black bandit makeup, and he's influenced by this film. He's a big fan of this film. And I'm a big fan of the Manic Street Preachers' first 6 albums. Everything Must Go, that's the name of the record, their 4th record that I heard and I fell in love with. That's my favorite album by the Manic Street Preachers. And they even did a cover on the British version of their first album. They did a cover of, what's it called, Damn Dog from this album?
Yep.
That's the
name of the song. Which is the
song.
Robin Johnson song, yeah.
Yep. Which is a good song. It's a good female empowerment, like punk rock type song. So the Manics covered it on their debut album, but I think it was deleted from the American version of it. But the Manic Street Preachers never did anything in America. They're a super cult band, much like this movie, Times Square, is a cult film.
Yeah. So here we have, an album, a movie that's influenced so many. The album has not been re-released. It probably deserves a bit of a reissue, a remaster. Like the movie, I would really like to see the director's cut, because as you said earlier in the show, that there was a bit of a strong relationship between the two female protagonists, which turned into a love. That's sort of been taken out, and I guess the movie would have sounded a bit, would have felt a bit more rounded, because it's a little bit jagged, where it's uneven and it's moving from scene to scene. There's great scenes in this movie, but as a sum of the parts, it doesn't sort of latch on perfectly.
Right. The narrative is probably messed up because of everything they took out of it. like usually in most films, whether they're cult movies, Hollywood movies, underground movies, B movies, there's a love relationship, a love affair. And there's none in this movie because they excised it from the final cut.
Yeah. And being teenagers and being sort of like of that 14, 15, that probably was not palatable to the film studio. The film studio, by the way, in the UK, it was released through EMI. So it was EMI that had sort of were releasing quite a few films in that era. The cut of this film's 111 minutes. So maybe it was another element, it was too long. So if
Yes.
they had this whole sort of narrative thread that there's a relationship and there's a romance side, I think anything, 130 minutes, 140 minutes, that may have been too long. And movies in that era were about getting bums on seats and making sure that they get as many screenings during the day. 111, it's still, I don't know, that's probably quite a long movie for this type of movie, if you know what I mean.
Yes. Because I think a lot of movies were more around the 90-minute mark, and this has 20 extra minutes.
Yeah. Well, have you got any final thoughts that you want to share in about the movie or the Times Square of 1979, 1980?
Oh, yeah, I just want to add a few things. That the screenplay was by Jacob Brackman, and the story was by the director Alan Moyle and Leanne Unger. And it's because Alan Moyle had found a diary. He got a secondhand couch, and he found a diary buried in the couch from a teenage girl, and it was all about her story, and that's what he based the film on, her story. And he said she was like living fast. It was a live fast, die young attitude. And from what he gleaned from her diary, she wasn't going to live past the age of 21 because she was living life so hard. It's almost as if she had a death wish, and that's what he based the story on. Also, the music, the incidental music in the movie is by Blue Weaver, a guy named Blue Weaver, and he's not well known, but he played with the Bee Gees for years. So there's your other Bee Gees, an RSO record, Robert Stigwood, Ty. He started out in some British bands. He's from Wales, actually, and he was in the Strawbs, and he played on two great Strawbs albums from the early 70s, the prog rock group, the Strawbs. And from Strawbs, he went and he toured with Mott the Hoople when they played America with Queen. Queen, I think, was the opener for Mott the Hoople. And from there, he went into the Bee Gees band. So he did the incidental music for the movie. And originally, this movie was titled She's Got the Shakes, which I don't think would have went over at all. I think it did better under the name Times Square.
Do you think Times Square is the right name for the movie? I mean, if they're getting a teenage audience, when you think of Times Square, I mean, especially 1979, 1980, you might think it's a movie like Taxi Driver.
It sort of was, because it shows the whole opening sequence of the movie that you were talking about with the Roxy Music song. I neglected to mention that most of the people you see that the camera pans over, they're all smoking cigarettes at the time. And conversely, the opposite of that is that I just watched the new Jerry Seinfeld movie, Unfrosted, and it takes place in 1962 or 1963, and none of the characters are smoking. So to me, that's a fake Hollywood movie, and this is real because so many people smoked in the 70s and 80s. Now it's sort of frowned upon, but back then, everyone did it. And most of the characters in the movie are smoking at one point or another.
But
so
I guess
it's the reality of the situation. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the actual title of the movie, Times Square, if you're looking at a movie list guide, you think Times Square, oh, I don't want to see that movie. That's just because Times Square in 1980 would have a connotation of being kind of sleazy, kind of dirty. And it's certainly, you're not selling the main plot narrative of these two teenagers on the run and their hijinks and kind of being like a rock and roll musical. It's something completely different. When you look at the word Times Square, you probably think Taxi Driver.
Which is a great movie.
It is, but not the sell to the teenage audience, and that's why it probably kind of flopped.
Before we go on, if I could say, I think Times Square is a better title than the original, where they were going to call it She's Got the Shakes. Yeah. Do you have a better title than Times
No,
Square?
I don't. I don't.
Okay.
But yeah, look, it's this movie is sort of like a mismatch, kind of like you've got this street movie, which has got a little bit of a danger menace element, and then you've got this light-hearted hijinks of these two teenage characters with a rock and roll soundtrack. Yeah, you've got these different sort of shifts in tonality, and I think it would be quite a hard sell. 2024, what do you think of this movie in the end? Final words and the soundtrack.
The soundtrack is better than the movie, definitely. Yep. It's an interesting film. There are good performances, because if Tim Curry made me feel so skeeved out and creeped out by his performance, that's a good performance then. And like you said, Robin Johnson was great. And it's a decent movie, but it, like you said, the perfect word you use, tone. The tone of the movie is off because not everything matches. It's it's like almost like a road trip film. The hijinks, the misadventures of these two girls, but the city would probably at the time have eaten them up and spit them out. And it sort of ends on a happy note, where the good girl lets the bad girl go. The good girl's going to go back to her life with her family, and the bad girl's going to try and make it. So it tries to end with an optimistic note, but really does it. If you know about Manhattan at the time, bad stuff probably would have happened to them.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting bit, because is it really a happy ending to the movie? Because the good girl goes back to her family, but it goes back to conformism. It goes back to a lifestyle that she doesn't want to be part of, and she loses a person, a friend, a love. So is it really a happy ending of such? You don't know.
No, probably not. You brought up a very good point. That's a salient point.
Yeah. So, look, I like this movie a lot, but it's really deeply flawed, and I would have loved to have seen the director's cut, his original vision on, but it's not to be. But it's the soundtrack, and I think this needs to get a re-release, because it's really some of the greatest songs of 1979-80, like, The Cure, XTC, Ramones, Roxy Music, Pretenders, Lou Reed. It's just
Joe Jackson.
We haven't spoken about Joe Jackson. Yeah,
I'm a big Joe Jackson fan too. Yeah,
it's a stellar thing.
But the whole thing about maybe getting a director's cut out there is, I read that they lost the footage, a lot of the footage that they had originally. No one knows where it is. And then there's always the legal rights to the music, always the copyright issues with the record labels. Would they let the song out? No, you have to pay me so and such amount of money. No, we're not going to pay you that much. It's not worth that much. So it always comes down to money and the record labels. Will they put out the songs again? Or let the songs be licensed for the film, is more the way to phrase it.
Yeah, well, that could be a reason why there's never been a re-release of this album. There could be some legal wrangling. And I know that there are a lot of pretty well-known movies of the late 70s that have never had a Blu-ray or DVD re-release, like Diane Keaton in Looking for Mr. Goodbar. That's never had a re-release because of the licensing problems with some of the disco soundtrack. I mean, that's an Oscar-nominated movie, and Diane Keaton, one of the greatest performances that she's ever put down, and it's in turnaround, never been released. So there's so many movies, Davey, in the 70s that have never got a re-release because they're in licensed turnaround, it's just a shame. So
same thing, if I could just add, the same thing happened with a TV show. One of my favorite TV shows from the late 70s, early 80s, WKRP in Cincinnati here in America, had all this great rock music and R&B music, and when they finally released it on DVD, they took all the music out, and it's unwatchable because it's not the original vision of the television show, but they couldn't get the rights to all these songs years later. Like one episode, they started with the Who song, Had Enough, from Who Are You, 1978, and it's not, and what's his name, Howard Hessman, playing the DJ Johnny Fever, he's dancing in the studio and to the song. And then without the music, it's different. It's weird. It's unwatchable. So a lot of these things come down to licensing rights. And that's why Looking for Mr. Goodbar, like you said, isn't out, and probably a lot of other movies.
Yeah. And I've seen actually a number of movies that eventually get a release, but different soundtrack. So they've made a decision. They've had some sort of, the studios made a decision that, okay, if we can't get the licensing rights for some of these songs, we'll substitute it. But then that sort of compromises the vision of the director and the vision of everybody behind the project by putting a song that may not quite fit. Soundtracks are not just bung together, because soundtracks it's a conscious artistic decision that you need to use a song for a particular sequence. Like Quentin Tarantino, he was the one who really sort of turned things around, and the soundtrack was king again.
Oh, yeah.
And people like bought that Pulp Fiction soundtrack. I know I'm going off track here. Jackie
No, it's
Brown,
okay. Yeah.
all those sort of things, because his music is so important to the synergy and the narrative of the movie. So it's inconceivable that 20 or 30 years down the track that, just to circuit break a licensing dispute, they substitute another song, because it would just, it just destroy the whole vision and the artistry of that whole movie.
I agree. And Pulp Fiction, we sold so many copies of that on CD in the 90s. I mean, eventually a lot were traded back. We always had it used for a low price, but that was a big seller of a soundtrack. Even Reservoir Dogs, his first film, was a big seller on CD. Not as big as Pulp Fiction, because that was more well-known. But yeah, his early soundtracks, the soundtracks to his early films, Quentin Tarantino's films, did very well on CD, because it was his artistic vision for his movie.
Yeah, I think he single-handedly resurrected the soundtrack in the 90s, and it also made people rediscover a lot of music that was not mainstream, was alternative. It was basically his personal record collection.
Yeah.
He was looking at, okay, I'm doing a scene in a movie, I'm doing, this is the sequence, and wouldn't this this band fit this particular scene, whether it's going to be the Sonics, I'm just making up stuff, the Sonics, or, the Trashmen, or something garage rock that would really suit this scene,
Well, the perfect example of what you're saying is Urge Overkill covering the Neil Diamond song, Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon, for Pulp Fiction. That's your perfect example.
Yeah. Yeah. But, well, I think that may be a reason why this is in turnaround, because there may be some licensing issues, because I just think that you'd look at the diamond quality caliber artists on this double album, it would sell. It would tick over, but there's got to be a reason. And maybe because the studio does not want this movie to be released because of the subject matter. And that's why the movie is tied in with the soundtrack, and that's why they're both kind of buried.
In limbo. Yeah.
In limbo. Thank you, Davey. As expected, I thought this conversation would go in a lot of different tangents, because it's, when you're talking about New York and you're talking about 1979 and 80, and you're talking about new wave and music, it can go in a lot of different directions. So wonderful to talk to you. Davey, do you want to plug your channel and what's happening at the moment?
Yes, my channel is Cretin Classics on YouTube, just like Rock Daydream Nation. And I have some interesting content up. And I've been doing a lot of stuff on Blue Oyster Cult. And pretty soon, and hopefully in the next week or so, 10 days, I'm going to put up my album ranking of Blue Oyster Cult, one of our favorite bands.
Fantastic. No, I love the Blue Oyster Cult. So check out Davey's channel. I'll put the link below when this show premieres. Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. Check out this movie. For all its flaws, it's really worthy to, watch. And also the soundtrack, it's kind of wonderful. But I appreciate what your views of the movie are, and, favorite songs off the the soundtrack. I really appreciate reading everyone's comments. But one thing's for sure, you'll see me and Davey on YouTube and doing more shows, talking rock in 2024. See you later and cheers.